as Lacey was kind enough to introduce, my name is Sean Devlin. I'm the curator of the archaeological collection at Mount Vernon. And I've served in that capacity since about 2016. And the talk I wanted to give today is actually, this will be a little bit of an experiment. It's basically an adaptation of what we do, or what I like to do when groups come and visit Mount Vernon, and we want to sort of bring them through either our archaeological lab or, as you'll see in just a second, our current temporary exhibit that focuses on the notion of talking about the enslaved individuals, the enslaved community that lived and worked at Mount Vernon and quite literally built it from the ground up over the course of the Washington's time there. So as I say, this is kind of an adaptation of what I would normally do in a physical space. We were all, before launching into my talk here a little bit earlier behind the scenes, we were all talking about the challenges of moving towards these digital presentations. But I do hope, I sort of preface the talk in this way, just to sort of say, it is sort of a talk, but you know, this is based in the notion of sort of an engagement. So I think it will be hard to actually do unmuting and asking questions, et cetera. But I know Lacey has volunteered to look at chat. And Lacey, if there are particularly pertinent questions as they come up, I would love to, feel free to let me know, to break in. I think it's the sort of point that I'm trying to make here.
Will do.
Yeah. So what I want to kind of also sort of say is that, you know, the talk is entitled "And Archaeology," right? I think, you know, it would be incredibly hard to summarize the lives of 319 individuals in about 30 minutes or so. So what I really wanted to do today was maybe think about it as a way to sort of pull back a little bit of the curtain on how I, as an archaeologist, am approaching some of the materials in our collections from a particular site, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to think critically about how we can know about enslaved lives at Mount Vernon, right? So this may be less of a summary and more of sort of an introduction to the way that I'm using materials to think about these issues and to think through these issues. And what I really do have to say is obviously that, as I just mentioned, that a lot of the discussion today will be based in Mount Vernon's temporary exhibit, this A Lives Bound Together exhibit. And really the point of that exhibit was to help bring individual stories to this community, to help sort of communicate a sense of individual lives, right? To restore humanity to people who were treated as property over the course of the 18th century. So with that in mind, I did just want to sort of talk a little bit about the approach that I take, but also, you know, I'm sort of following in the footsteps of my predecessors here. As you heard Molly Kerr talk about earlier, she had been involved in some of the research that went into this exhibit and sort of the research behind the exhibit. Also, a number of individuals in the archaeology department, Eleanor Breen, who was mentioned previously as well, did a lot of work for this exhibit on materials. And also, I should mention very explicitly, one of our curators in Mount Vernon, a woman named Jessie McLeod, actually curated the Lives Bound Together exhibit. So, you know, it's a narrative that we all have sort of talked about and sort of has become part of how we approach the topic at Mount Vernon, but it really is a team effort. So I want to make sure that that's very clear from the beginning. And one of the most, I think, pertinent ways to sort of express the fact that it is a team effort, right, is this notion about how do we approach archaeology, particularly historical archaeology at Mount Vernon. And I think this is true for the field as a whole, right? And I use this slide just to sort of help illustrate, right, that archaeology is really about the material record, right? This is objects that individuals used in the course of their daily lives and disposed of through just sort of natural daily actions, right? In a certain way, it's unbiased because people usually are not thinking about what their future narrative will be, what people in the future will say about them based on the trash that's generated from their daily actions. But in a certain way, it's also incomplete, right? we don't necessarily always know the individual name of somebody who disposed of a plate in a refuse pit, right? And that's why we can really benefit from intertwining the material record and the historical record, right? The historical record um, is oftentimes, though not completely, is written by elites, right? Individuals like George Washington. We were very fortunate at Mount Vernon that Washington was away from the estate so often, and also tended to be pretty obsessive in terms of understanding what was going on while he was away. So we have a great documentary record associated with the daily life on the estate, the work and movement of people across the estate. But it also, and it does in some ways point out individuals, right? So again, Molly earlier this morning had referenced a database that was actually created at Mount Vernon, trying to track all those references in the historical documents to individuals, enslaved individuals in the past. So it's really by bringing these two separate strains of evidence together that we can create more full narratives about life and experience among this community. And that's sort of what's attempted to be illustrated here in the cable in the middle of the screen. So with that said, that's sort of a preface, right, for how we're approaching this topic here. Now, obviously, I'll spend most of today actually talking a little bit more about the material record, because that's what our archaeological information is really adding to the story. I do want to also sort of take one more sort of contextual slide here, right? And it really comes to this idea of getting back to the idea of the symposium today, even the sort of quote unquote hidden history, right? And why these histories are so important. I think this is one of the most powerful graphics that we've put together in our department and at Mount Vernon. And it helps tell the story about why do we really and immediately need to talk about the enslaved community at Mount Vernon. This is a 1793 map that I was actually originally sketched by George Washington himself about the sort of delineating the full extent of Mount Vernon as he owned it towards the end of his life. And as many of you probably know, Mount Vernon was, like many of the other plantations in Virginia, divided up into what are called quarters, right? So there would be quarter farms where different agricultural activities were taking place, et cetera. And it's actually much more extensive than the current museum grounds themselves. And what this graphic shows is those different quarters sort of outlined in sort of white and red. And on each quarter, each individual figure represents an enslaved person who was living there at the time of Washington's death in 1799. And I think what this graphic does is immediately pull, out in sort of a visible sense, the vast community that was spread across the landscape at Mount Vernon, and how important they were to the functioning of the plantation, not just in terms of the sort of economic generation of wealth that the plantation system was set up, but also literally to running things like the household at Mount Vernon inside the mansion. And to that degree, that's where I'm going to focus today, is the quarter, the sort of one of the 5 farms that Washington sort of subdivided his property into, was called the Mansion House Farm. And hopefully my arrow is coming up on the screen. I'm sort of circling where that is, and that's roughly contiguous with the property that Mount Vernon Ladies Association owns today, and we think of as the museum. So as you can see, there's quite a large population of enslaved individuals who live on the home farm. Now that farm is, those individuals are primarily employed in skilled crafts, in domestic service, and other non-agricultural activities. The other 4 farms are actually where the agricultural labor is taking place. So when we look at the home farm, we do also need to recognize that we're really exploring the material culture of a certain segment of the enslaved population at Mount Vernon. Now, given that I've just sort of spent this time talking about all these, oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No.
some of our viewers are having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. Could you
Oh,
speak up
okay.
just a little bit?
Yeah, I will speak up. I will, I'm sorry, I'll practice my shouting here. Yeah, and thank you for letting me know that, Lacey, actually. Now that we've sort of honed in on the home farm, what we're going to look at actually is attempting to find the material culture that we can really say is associated with that community that was living there, right? Those skilled craftspeople, those domestic laborers, laborers in the domestic context of the mansion, et cetera. And we can turn to documentary records because we know that there is a location that we can tie to that community, right? What we can see on the left here is actually a plan of Mount Vernon that was drawn by a man named Samuel Vaughan, who visited Mount Vernon in the late 1780s and sort of created this plan as a gift to give to George Washington as a way to say thank you. And in this plan that he created, we can see marked off, here's the Potomac River up on the upper part of the plan. Here's the mansion house, George Washington's mansion there. And off just to the north of the house, up the service lane, is this structure that's marked A in the plan, or superimposed with an A over the plan. And Vaughan called this structure in two different iterations. He called it the quarter for families or the house for families. And this seems to be a sort of large barrack style domestic residence for at least a large number of these individuals who are held in bondage at the mansion house. Now, we know that this structure was standing by the 1780s and fully occupied. We're not absolutely clear on when it was constructed, but we know it was probably constructed by 1760, used throughout the 1780s. And then actually we do get one last glimpse of it here, one pictorial piece of evidence for it here in this oil painting that Edward Savage did. Now, it wasn't obviously the focus of his attention. It was actually, he was looking at the east face of Mount Vernon and doing a landscape painting of it. But nestled in just at the end of the lane is a structure that is should be the house for families. It's interesting. We have a couple of documentary references actually to the destruction of this structure in 1792 or 93, when George Washington actually instructs his overseers to have enslaved laborers begin stripping sort of the clapboards off the frame structure in preparation of the erection of some new quarters that are attached to his greenhouse. And those are the quarters that are used in the later part of the 1790s at the home farm. But what's fantastic is that's sort of all we know really sort of documentarily about this structure, right? We've got very, very few little threads. We actually know quite a bit about, maybe less about the structure itself, but we have been fortunate to find an archaeological remnant of that quarter. And that work actually began in the mid-80s. It was among one of the first locations that was identified by the Virginia Center for Archaeological Research that came in and sort of did surveys of the property for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association as they decided whether or not they needed to invest in an archaeology department to sort of take on that full-time task of managing the resources that the estate actually had. And we're very grateful that they did decide to do that. Well, what the Virginia Center for Archaeological Research found in the mid-80s and then was subsequently followed up on by our newly formed archaeology department at Mount Vernon was the material remains of the house for families were actually this 6x6 brick-lined cellar that had been sort of filled in and covered over by the succeeding centuries of construction and destruction and various infrastructure improvements you can see in the photo there. But when they excavated portions of the fill in the cellar, what they discovered is that, as you can see in this sort of profile image, this sort of rainbow profile picture on the side, is that despite having modern pipe trenches run through and staircases pass over it, etc. The layers that were, most of the layers that were inside the brick, remaining brick portion of the cellar were actually primary refuse. Some of it, the lowest levels, were related to the actual use of the brick lined cellar, as a storage facility, while the house was being occupied, while the structure was being occupied above it. Some of the later layers that are a little bit higher up in the profile are probably actually related to when the cellar maybe became less of an active storage location for the structure and actually was being filled in. It sort of became a handy receptacle for some of the just sort of refuse that was building up, and sort of it was a good place to sort of stick it and get it out of the way. And then finally, the topmost layers are actually very clearly material that's associated with the 1792-93 destruction of the building and a rapid fill-in of the last bits of the cellar hole there to prep the space for the construction of the later quarters that I just mentioned associated with the greenhouse. So this really, the excavation of this cellar feature provided that nascent archaeology department with a really fantastic collection of material that was definitively associated with this community, with these individuals who are living in the structure above it, right? And I really can't overemphasize how important of a collection this really is, not just in Mount Vernon, but I think also regionally in the state, because it is, such a fantastically well sealed and encapsulated collection of material. So what I want to kind of do today is think about the ways that both the archaeologists at the time in the mid 80s, but also myself and other folks have begun to work through this, the materials that were recovered, and think about how we think about things, right? If this makes some sense. And really what I want to highlight here is thinking about the ways that the material in the cellar can be used to think about different experiences of this community, right? And that's sort of illustrated to some degree in these two images that are also associated with the on the slide. One is a very famous image by Latrobe of an overseer watching enslaved women hoeing a tobacco field, right? This is sort of the classic image of enslaved labor being extracted in these plantation contexts for the wealth of plantation owners. And that is definitely one of the tracks that we need to think about when we approach material associated with enslaved communities. We need to tell that story about the way that the plantation system was set up to extract labor for wealth. But I think also equally important, and one that's important for telling a complete story and to really sort of help humanize and individualize the experience of enslaved people, is to also think about the material in the context of how these individuals who were literally in the process of being turned into property or being treated as property, right, within this system, found ways in their daily life to reaffirm their own individualism, right? And to make meaning in their own lives, despite the sort of horrors of what was happening to them. So this is sort of the sort of dual track that I want to kind of think through some of the material that we're going to see in just a moment. Now, I'll take them one at a time here. So this slide helps illustrate how I kind of think we can think through some of the materials in this track of sort of speaking to the variety of different forms of labor that are being extracted from this community. Now, I'll kind of, like I said, I'll try and talk about each of these objects individually to some degree, but I may, in the course of this, read a few snippets here and there and talk more or less about some of them. But please let me know if you want to talk about any of them in more depth. First, I want to sort of talk about sort of these things. Given that I sort of said that we're not dealing with agricultural labor taking place here at the home farm, but we are talking about lots of manual, physical labor that's being extracted from individuals, right? And some of the most clear examples of that are these iron tools that are here, and they might not be quite as easily identifiable to untrained eyes, but this lower item is actually a felling axe, so the type of axe that's used for falling timber trees, possibly even used for rough shaping of wood in the construction process. And this seemingly rather sort of nondescript curved piece of iron, length of iron, is actually a chisel. It's a gouge, or I should say a gouge, a woodworking gouge that is used in the processes of shaping wood and construction, et cetera, right? So what we actually see these as is sort of a venue to look at the labor of enslaved men and boys who are doing carpentry work for Washington on Mount Vernon, and it's really their labor, right? Sort of their felling of the trees, their beginning of working on both infrastructure and also detailed work that sort of enables the plantation as a whole to run, and also leads to, right, sort of some of the buildings and the labor put into the structures that we can walk around in today. Now, an example and an interesting connection is that one of the enslaved individuals held at the Mansion House farm was a man who was named Sambo Anderson. And he did work as a carpenter for Washington for a number of years. And he actually, in his subsequent life, later in his life, after he was manumitted, he recounted that he learned some of his skill from the master tradesman William Sears, who actually did some of the work on Mount Vernon's new room. But also, Sears himself was involved in Gunston Hall's, some of Gunston Hall's construction, or some of the work done at Gunston Hall. So it is really kind of interesting too to recognize the real skill that some of these individuals had, even though their labor was being extracted in this sense. Just for fear that I'm going to get too into each individual piece, I'll move along a little bit. This sort of redware clear lead glazed fragment here is actually part of a milk pan. And milk pans, as the name suggests, as we all probably pretty much know, were used in separating cream from milk from milk in kitchens and dairies, but could also be associated with a whole variety of other activities, cooking activities that are sort of taking place in those spaces. Obviously, this was found in the quarter, so it may also be related to cooking and sort of food preparation and food serving in the quarter, but it also speaks to the labor that was extracted from enslaved women who were serving as cooks. A woman named Doll served as Washington's long-term cook in the kitchen for many years. And you know, we can see these objects also sort of popping up. Another area which I think is really fascinating is, oh, sorry, I clicked too quick, is this dark green glass down here. Now, we usually associate this with wine bottle glass, 18th century wine bottle glass. This object is actually quite large, and it actually appears to be part of a bell jar. And objects such as that, if anyone is a gardener out there, you're familiar with, they're large glass sort of bell-shaped objects that you put over either seedlings or tender plants to create a warmer microclimate, right? So this object, I think, speaks directly to some of the skilled labor that's being extracted from enslaved men who are serving as in the gardens at Mount Vernon. Right, it's sort of the ornamental landscape, the food generating aspects of those gardens were equally dependent on the labor of these enslaved individuals, and that's physically showing up through some of these objects we find in the quarter. Similarly, this straight pin speaks very directly to, we can think of it as an object used in sewing and sort of mending of clothing. That speaks very directly to the labor of enslaved women and girls who oftentimes worked even in the Washington's bedchamber underneath the eyes of Martha Washington, you know, creating clothing for the enslaved community out of bulk cloth that was purchased from England or from London, from agents in London. And you know, sort of it, like I said, this speaks directly to that extractive and the variety of labor that was extracted from the community that was living in the quarters. Now we have here an object that I think sort of helps us span this notion, begin to get at some of the other aspects that I wanted to talk about. So this is obviously a hoe, or maybe I shouldn't say obviously, but this is a hoe blade. And oftentimes, right, I sometimes use this object to talk quite explicitly about that sort of radical transformation that takes place in Virginia plantations that has massive impacts for the enslaved population throughout the colony, where planters like Washington transitioned from growing tobacco to growing diversified crops like wheat. I won't talk about that today, but if anybody's interested, I love to talk about that and the implications that material change has on the lives of folks across these plantation holdings. But today, actually, I'll focus in on where I usually go on the second part of that story, which is that this hoe in particular is not a tobacco hoe, right? Not specialized for tobacco cultivation. Instead, it looks like a sort of a garden variety garden hoe, right? Now this is really interesting because obviously, like we were just talking about with the bell jars, there are enslaved individuals who are working in the gardens at Mount Vernon. This may be read in a certain sense as potentially leading to speaking to that labor. It may also be speaking to the labor that enslaved individuals put in after that, which the Washingtons and other plantation owners demanded of them, right? Now, as a lot of you probably know, by the mid 18th century, there had been a sort of custom in Virginia plantations. Now, it was not required, obviously, and was very dependent and arbitrary based on each plantation owner. But enslaved individuals generally were allowed access to small plots of ground, which they could cultivate food crops and small amounts of livestock for either to supplement the rations that the plantation owner often issued to them. And I think that's sort of the direction that I'd like to push, that I think this hoe can help us think about a little bit more. And we get even better evidence very directly. Oh, Lacey, do you have a question?
I do, and I admit this one is from me and not from one of our audience members.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a tobacco hoe and a garden hoe?
So it is fantastic, and I wish I had a slide. Like I said, this is part of the problem with the digital stuff, right? It's all in PowerPoint. There are actually English tool makers, right, are literally making different shapes and sort of weights, et cetera, right? There are different hoes hoes become very specialized for specific crops, right? This is not just for Virginia, but also down in the Caribbean, right? You got hoes that are based, that are specifically designed and manufactured for use in sugar planting and even down to sub tasks that you need to do to cultivate that sugar cane in the first place. So there are trade catalogs where they're actually advertising their wares, and folks would have gotten those in the colonies and known about the different types of hoes. So we were able to take a look at the shaping of this hoe, and it has to do with sort of where the shoulders are in it, and the sort of rounding of it, the thinness of the blade, and some of the the thinness of the what's called an eye, where the handle goes here. And again, this is not a specific version of a hoe, so it is more of this sort of generic garden hoe, right? In that sense.
Well, I'm going to have to do some research and learn more about hoes now.
I can share some files after this. It would be fantastic. You'll more than you want to know. Yeah.
Lily Carhart is also in the chat offering me some research.
Excellent. Excellent. Lily's here. Yes, Lily she is the expert. Actually, she's the one who's helped us with this for the last several years. But this speaks directly to this notion about some of the other kinds of evidence we recovered from the House for Families, right? And that's, again, when I talk to general audiences, they don't always know that archaeologists can get this kind of information, and it does take specialized knowledge. I'm not a archaeobotanist, but a botanical analyst, but we were fortunate at the House for Families to excavations to think about the idea that we might be able to recover food remains and plant-based evidence. Took the appropriate sampling techniques and then hired an outside consultant to provide information for us. And really what we found was a variety of different evidence, right? We can see sort of on my right-hand side of the screen, I think everybody else's right-hand side of the screen, we can see botanical evidence that might represent materials that Washington is, or a plantation owner would traditionally issue to the enslaved population as part of their rationing, right? We can see things like corn and wheat and oats. And obviously those things were in measured amounts, were issued out to on an individual basis. But we can also see crops that might have been cultivated in some of these provision grounds I was talking about, things like peas and cowpeas, right? Sort of extra beans. This bottle gourd is interesting too, right? Because it's not necessarily a food crop, but it is something that could be used as either as an organic object, right? These bottle gourds also serve really can serve as utensils or as sort of cantini type things, etc., or even as musical instruments, right? So really fascinating material coming here, but certainly things that look like they might have been cultivated, you know, are certainly not issued by folks like Washington, by planters. We can also see objects that, or evidence for things that might have been collected from the landscape, whether they're cultivated or not. We can't definitively assert, but you know, objects like fruit, peach pits. We also have raspberry seeds, etc. But we can see the way that enslaved individuals really did use all the opportunities available to them to collect materials that might have supplemented, plant-based materials that might have supplemented some of the rations that were coming to them from plantation owners. We can see that as well in the faunal evidence, right? The bone evidence of animals. So here again on the right, we can see animals that we know Washington used in the rationing system that he implemented with the enslaved population at Mount Vernon. Animals like pig and sheep, actually, which is quite interesting because it is a little bit different than many of the sort of standard plantation practices at the time. We can also see some cattle bones, etc. But you know, items that we know were sort of issued out in measured portions to the population. But the House for Families collection also includes objects that are very clearly animals that were hunted in the sort of surrounding landscape, right? So not only do we have gun flints and flint that's meant to be turned into gun flints down here, but we also have lead shot, right? And we have sprue, which is sort of evidence of actual manufacturing of that shot in the House for Families, which is fantastic. And we can see species like turkey and deer and duck represented in the faunal assemblage as well, right? And these would have been animals that could potentially have been hunted throughout that landscape that is represented by that broader Mount Vernon that I sort of showed in the original slide. We can also see animals that are possibly represent or evidence that possibly represents enslaved individuals really taking advantage of some of the time that they might have been forced to labor for Washington to also get goods for themselves, to sort of increase their own access to further food resources, right? So this image is inset here is actually of a number of different fish bones, right? We know that Washington ran a fishery off several fisheries over the course of his lifetime at Mount Vernon in different locations, and enslaved men were used as the fishers in that operation. A lot of those fish were actually barreled up, salted and barreled up, and then sold for international markets. Some of them would have been saved and issued to enslaved individuals on the estate. But we also see species in the fish remains from the House for Families that would not have fallen in this category, right? Things like sunfish and catfish and other sorts of animals that you could see enslaved individuals either in the process of doing their fishery work, right? Sort of the bycatch, maybe held and reserved and then brought home, or maybe also representing, right, sort of, again, being very careful not to paint any sort of rosy picture here, but if individuals had free time where they might be able to exploit resources on the river through fishing or through catching marine resources on their own time, may also represent some of that. Now, this other inset is actually eggshell. And again, lots of folks are always impressed when we show them the fact that we can recover eggshell from sites like the House for Families after hundreds of years, which is great just to show what archaeology can actually capture. But it's even more great because it does speak directly to this notion that, right, sort of enslaved individuals may again have been using those provision grounds to grow small animals, traditionally poultry, because they aren't allowed to own larger animals generally. But we can see the way that those things like chickens can provide quite a bit of nutritional value, not just in their meat, but also through the eggs that they produce, and how that may have made a real difference to those communities living inside the House for Families structure. It also may have allowed some individuals to have access to markets, right? And Molly really discussed some fantastic information about sort of local stores in Colchester. Obviously, also Alexandria towards the end of the 18th century would have served as a market location. There also would be, you know, sort of the Sunday markets in which individuals, enslaved individuals, may have been able to take any extra produce or eggs or things like that that they would have been able to accrue again only after the time that you know, planters like Washington would have been extracting from them, but they may have been able to take those goods to Sunday markets and exchange them either through systems of barter or potentially through cash as a medium of exchange. We do also know that individuals at Mount Vernon could directly acquire cash. And again, we want to be careful about how we frame that. I know this is a smart, intelligent audience, so we're very clear. This does not negate by any means sort of the horrible inequalities and sort of lack of access to any sort of monetary accrual that enslaved individuals would have had within the plantation system. But we do see some evidence of enslaved people having access to currency, right? Very directly here with this 1/8 piece of Spanish silver. And we want to think about how enslaved individuals might have used those limited economic opportunities that would have been afforded to them to perhaps express their own individualism, right? And we can also see material evidence of that from the House for Families. So we can see here a wonderful two-piece button in the center of the screen. It's copper alloy. Buttons like this are really fascinating. Again, I don't want to bore the crowd, but we can actually see that they're made of usually a bone disc on the back, and a thin sheet of copper alloy is usually hammered into a mold to make this basket weave pattern that you see in the center. And that thin sheet is then crimped over the bone back element. And oftentimes string or catgut or something of that nature would be threaded through the holes that you can see on the back. And actually that would have created the attachment point for clothing items. So of course, in the 18th century, buttons and clothes were a lot more disassociated or more freely interchanged. You could buy buttons, right? Individual buttons and put them on your clothing. We know Washington is ordering large amounts of buttons for the plantation, but the variety of buttons we see at the House for Families really does speak to the fact that maybe some of this material, some of this variation is actually enslaved individuals taking part in local markets and selecting things for themselves. You know, we have here, I'll call this back at the end, but we have actually an inset to a cufflink button. And cufflinks would have been much more common than they are today as closures for any sort of, clothing, a variety of clothing items in the 18th century. And you know, they would have been very cheap as well. So we have a large number of inlays and some complete cufflink buttons from the House for Families as well. Other objects, small objects that may have spoken to, you know, attempting to increase or ease the experience of daily life for individuals. We can find things like marbles at the House for Families, right? And it's very easy, without being too cliche, but it's very easy to think about this as, you know, these small objects that may have benefited children living at the estate, at the house for family structure, or even adults, right? Marbles can also be used for gaming of all sorts. I won't belabor because I have a feeling I've gone on. I don't have my timer with me. So I won't belabor this too much, but I did want to also think about, given that I'm talking a little bit about economics and variability, et cetera, and how some of the objects we have may speak to this notion about enslaved communities taking advantage of opportunities. We're also approaching this through, now none of this is definitive just yet. There's always continuing research that's sort of happening and needs to happen. We need to continually reevaluate our conclusions. But a really interesting thing happens with some of the ceramics from the house for families. So here in the center, we see actually it's a white salt glaze stoneware plate. And that object is actually from the house for families cellar. And what you can see is these little circular objects with wavy lines. Archaeologists and ceramicists call this decorative pattern a barley pattern, right? And what's really interesting is that white salt glaze plates are not uncommon at Mount Vernon. In fact, Washington himself places large orders for entire table settings, 250 piece table settings at a time in the late 1750s and subsequently. And so we find white salt glaze all over the place. The vast majority of the material we find across the rest of the estate is actually another decorative pattern, which you can see in the smaller image, which is called in this case, it's got a basket weave sort of pattern here, and also a diaper dot pattern. Again, I won't get too into the details, but you can see very easily that these are two distinct decorative techniques that were applied in a factory in England, in a workshop in England, and then sold, right? The only place we see this barley pattern actually, or I take that back, not the only place, but one of the only places that we see this barley pattern is the house for families, which again suggests, as Molly sort of talked about earlier, folks like Washington were placing large orders directly with agents in London, and so would have received 250 item orders all at once. And while they wouldn't necessarily have created table settings in a match sense like we might think of today, you can get the idea that when you make a big order like that, you're going to get everything kind of coming at one time. A difference in decorative pattern may actually reflect the fact that someone went out and purchased this at a different location, that this wasn't a gift from Washington, but it was actually something that came from an alternate source, like one of the stores that were housed in Colchester or later Alexandria. Now, again, that's something we need to really sort of explore, but there is some tantalizing evidence here about variation that we really do want to look at a little bit more closely. Here's another example. This is a ware type called Wealden ware. These objects in the center were recovered from the house for families. Here's an example from Winter's collection. I just pulled it off the internet, just to give you a sense for what a hollow teaware might look like of this type of ceramic. Again, this would have been popular in the mid 18th century. What's again interesting, we don't see this we don't get very much of this anywhere else at Mount Vernon so far. There are still excavations to take place, and we need to look through the collections, but it is tantalizing that we can see objects that are relatively unique in the house for families as opposed to the broader landscape at the estate. Here's another item, just speaking a little bit more about sort of the ways individuals may have been finding things to affirm their individualism, to sort of stake a claim on their humanity, right? This is a small copper alloy hinged sort of ring, and we think actually it would have been part of a small Battersea box or a snuff box, a little trinket box. It may not look exactly like this. This is just an item that I pulled off of actually an auction website, but you can get a sense for what this, where this object actually would have fit in a historical object. And again, by no means do I want this to sort of come off as saying, oh, there's fancy objects in the house for families. They had access to fancy luxury goods. I simply want to point out that there may be an ability by individuals to select objects for themselves, right? This likely would have had meaning to somebody in the house for families, and would have been something that maybe, a small object like this may have helped them reaffirm their sense of self within the system that was, again, turning them into property. Another great example is something that really sort of speaks to this individual experience, or sort of may speak to individual experience, is this small fragment of blue glass. Now this object, you can see, it took a while to identify, and it's really a full team effort to actually find, clearly and fully denote it. But I want to sort of point out that what you can see here is actually a molded fleur-de-lis on this object, and we were actually able to find a matching example in the Met collections, as a matter of fact. And what it turns out is that this is actually a portion of a French-made perfume or snuff bottle, right? And it's really fantastic because this bottle would have been made, the glass house that made this bottle was in Orleans, France, and was run by a man named Bernard Perrault. And that glass house was really in operation from the 17th century through the 18th century. So the chances are it closed, I think, in 1754, but it seems like the height of production would have been earlier in the 18th century. So it's really kind of an interesting object to find in this context of a site that would have been primarily occupied in the latter part of the 18th century. And it may speak to, right, sort of objects that are being curated and having personal meaning to some of the enslaved individuals who lived in the house for families. Again, these are, we need to be careful with some of our assumptions and sort of conclusions, but I think these are meaningful ways to sort of get into the experience of the enslaved individuals living at Mount Vernon during this time. Now, one of the most important objects that we have, and Lacey, how am I doing on time? I literally can't see my clock, and I want to make sure that I'm not over talking.
We've got just a few more minutes before I want to open it up for questions, so we
Okay.
can have a tiny bit of a break before we start with Henry.
Great. Yeah, so I'll point out just here that this wine bottle seal also speaks to memory and legacy at the House for Families. This is actually, if you guys are familiar, wine bottles from the 18th century, members of the planter class oftentimes personalize them to some degree by ordering their own sort of glass marks to be put on them. So here you can see the letters D.P. Custis, and this is in reference to Daniel Parke Custis, who was actually Martha Washington's first husband. So if you remember this map that I showed you at the very beginning, the different colors on the map denote individuals who are either owned outright by George Washington through inheritance or purchase over the course of his lifetime, and individuals who were brought to Mount Vernon with the marriage to Martha. Because when Daniel Parke Custis died intestate, Martha actually acquired the right to a portion of his property over the course of her own natural lifetime, and that's called a dowry, right? Her dower right. And that property, of course, includes enslaved individuals. And a number of them came to Mount Vernon with her on the marriage. Those individuals weren't owned by Martha. They were actually continued to be owned by the estate of Daniel Parke Custis, and when she died, actually were returned to the estate for division among his heirs. So what you can actually see in this map is a color-coded distinction between individuals owned by Washington and those owned by Martha, or by the Custis estate, I should say. And really what's sort of a little bit heartbreaking about that object, that wine bottle seal, right, is that we can see two different communities brought together in the House for Families. They lived together for 40 years, intermarried, formed a single community. And here, as you can see, that community was dispersed throughout the landscape and really intermixed. But upon Martha's death, George's death when he manumitted, those individuals that he owned or wrote into his will that he would, and then upon Martha's death, when the individuals who were owned by the Custis estate were divided up among the heirs of the Custis estate, we can see that the community really fractured across those ownership lines. So I will stop there, I think, Lacey, because I've got some other things, but I don't want to overtalk or not leave plenty of room for questions. So um,
Well, we've got one question in the chat about whether or not you have found definitive evidence of enslaved children at the house. I'm assuming this means the house for families. And was there a nursery somewhere on the land?
oh, okay, yeah, interesting. So there is a little bit of a, I should have prefaced this, the house for families does not necessarily just mean either that it was literally a house for families, only families living there. Actually, it would have been quite a varied community, right? So that being said, there generally the way that enslaved the plantations were run is that enslaved children remained with their mother. And even if the mother was working in an agricultural context where she would be out in the fields, there oftentimes at those individual quarters that I sort of showed you across the landscape, perhaps an elderly member of the community would be watching younger children, or a child who was older but not old enough to perform physical labor might be charged with watching some of the younger children. So there is no quote unquote singular nursery at Mount Vernon by any means. And in terms of definitive evidence of children, it's always hard to to find an object that speaks to just a particular person or type of person, right? Like I said, that marble, I think we always do use that to sort of help highlight that notion of children at Mount Vernon. But I'll be frank, right? Marbles could also be used by adults in games and stuff. I think this is where having a strong historical record is fantastic too, because we know from the documentary record, right, that there are children living in this space as well. So
that's one of the really challenging things for us at Gunston Hall. We have so very little written documentation that we rely incredibly heavily on our archaeological record, and there is so much, it's so scattered, it's such a different layout than Mount Vernon, that we've found one location where people who were enslaved resided, but we know that there were many others, and many of them aren't on our property anymore.
Yeah, no, and that's extreme. That's something I said I have a habit of talking too much, but yeah, subsequently some of the later slides, I would love to, if folks are interested, I would love to feel free to email me, because we are looking at some of those other sites that are not having to do with the domestic laborers, but looking at folks who are out there in the agricultural context, and some fascinating comparisons back and forth within the community.
Yeah, I'm really curious if you guys have you learned anything at this point about the differences in what was available to people who were situated more in an agricultural setting versus what people in a more domestic setting had access to?
Yeah, I think that is something the House for Families is so unique because it is such it is a feature that was filled with trash, right? So it is right. Very different than some of the excavations we've done at some of these other locations. That is definitely one of the topics we're interested in. I think there is, in a generalistic sense, a lot of things I was talking about, provision grounds, access, et cetera, that is comparable across the estate. I do think certainly we have to be cognizant of the fact that skilled labor, access to the household may provide opportunities for enslaved individuals. Obviously, they also come very much freighted with surveillance and opportunities for punishment, et cetera, as well. So I don't want to, that's not by any means to say good, bad, right? Or a better life, right? It's just simply to.
They're very different.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, agreed. We're finding the same things here at Gunston Hall. We are being asked if we're providing emails for the speakers so we can follow up with them. And I believe that's a speaker by speaker basis. So if our speakers choose to, and we will, I will touch base with Sean in just a moment to see if that is the case. Yes.
I really don't want to eat up too much more time, but can I toss up just 3 slides with?
Yeah, of course. I took it down so that we could see you while we were answering.
No worries.
Questions.
Sorry.
No worries at all.
Back to my this, as you can tell, this is why this is a walking tour is better usually. Here we go. So, oh no, excuse the blitz. Excuse the blitz, everybody.
I mean, I'm enjoying getting to look at them all again.
Yeah,
I could
here's the
stare at
rest.
all of the archaeological items forever.
Here's the right. Obviously, we have a cemetery site that we are documenting, not excavating materials from, but we are documenting a cemetery site at Mount Vernon too, a very important component of the enslaved community. I did want to just point out, Mount Vernon does have a number of resources that sort of speak to these ideas. We have this, the database of the enslaved community that Molly actually referenced earlier today. So thank you, Molly, for your work and also the reference, the plug. We also have our archaeological collections online. So some of the objects that I was showing today, we actually have them up on the website and folks can see and read interpretive text as well. I'm going to put in a plug for two historians who've written and really are the go-to sources for enslaved life at Mount Vernon from that documentary side particularly. One is our own Mary Thompson has written a book, The Only Unavoidable Subject of Regret, that really sort of covers Washington's time and the enslaved community, his relationship to the enslaved community at Mount Vernon. And then Scott Casper had written a text called Sarah Johnson's Mount Vernon that really speaks to the enslaved community in the 19th century at Mount Vernon. Also, we've got our temporary exhibit, Lives Bound Together, that is still there in physical form, and we're open, and we are also moving that to an online digital version as well. So all that information will be available to folks online.
And just to clarify, Sean, y'all are open on your regular schedule. Tours of both the mansion and the education center and all of the grounds are open as normal.
Exactly.
But
yeah.
definitely recommend, I know from my perspective here at Gunston Hall, I definitely recommend if you can purchase a ticket in advance, makes things ever so much easier.
Yeah, it helps us know. It also really helps us plan ahead because we are sort of implementing those precautions we need to. And yeah, so come on down and it'll be a good time.
Yep. And if you're not interested in visiting right now, but you would like to support Mount Vernon, it's mountvernon.org/donate, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sean. I really appreciate your time today.